Right, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists. My name is Jen Judson. I'm the Vice President of the National Press Club and land warfare reporter for Defense News. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Amberin Zaman, the senior correspondent at Al Monitor, where she reports from the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. In her role at Al Monitor, she examines the politics of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria and writes the outlet's Briefly Turkey newsletter. Prior to Al Monitor, Amberin covered Turkey, the Kurds, and conflicts in the region for outlets including the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Voice of America. She also served as the Economist Turkey correspondent from 1999 to 2016 and has worked as a columnist for several Turkish language outlets. Thank you for joining us, Amberin, and welcome to the National Press Club.
And thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have our discussion today. Today, we're going to discuss your experience as a foreign correspondent, covering some of the biggest stories in the region. And we'll also take questions from the audience. So those tuning in, please use the chat window to submit your questions to Amberin. So I was going to start with Syria, but I think there's a lot of news happening in Turkey. So I'd love to just jump into some questions related to that region first, Amberin. So the US-Turkey relationship appears to be off to a rocky start. President Erdogan is still waiting for a phone call from President Biden, who during the campaign called him an autocrat. What do you make out of that? And where do you see relations between these two countries headed in this new administration?
Well, it's certainly a much tougher time for Turkey because, as you know, President Trump really indulged Erdogan. They had this sort of chemistry between them where they sort of admired each other's autocratic, populist, sort of polarizing characteristics. And Turkey managed to get quite a bit out of the Trump administration, including most notably this green light to invade northeast Syria and to attack the United States Kurdish allies there. However, things have changed now. It's a new world, and as you said, President Biden has yet to telephone Erdogan, and let's not forget that Turkey is an extremely important NATO ally, so it is actually quite unusual. You know, one of the first trips that President Obama made was to Turkey. And now we have this sort of chill that's set in, and very clear and distinct message from Washington that either, you shape up or, things are just not going to get better between us and don't expect any more mollycoddling. And of course, one of the main problems between the two countries is Turkey's acquisition of Russian-made S-400 missiles, which the United States says Turkey needs to get rid of.
You bring S-400 missile defense system up, and that's obviously been an issue for a long time. And I actually believe the Trump administration had limited sanctions due to this particular issue. Do you see a way out of this standoff at this point?
Well, the way out that's been proposed to Turkey is that Turkey mothballs these S-400s, meaning parks them somewhere, and then allows the United States to come in periodically, set up a monitoring mechanism whereby it's, ascertained that Turkey is not using these things, not activating them. And, that's like $2 billion plus of Turkish taxpayers' money down the drain. But at least the relationship with the United States will come back on course. As you said, Turkey is under sanctions. Those sanctions would be revoked, presumably. But of course, it's what we've seen so far is this very sort of defiant language coming out of Turkey from the president's office, from the president, saying they're not going to do that. So how do we get beyond that? And it's not like the S-400s are the only problem. There are other problems. Turkey is very upset about the fact that the United States continues to partner with this Syrian Kurdish militia which also has links to another Kurdish group that's fighting Turkey. So Turkey says they're all terrorists, they're all the same, and you've got to stop this. And the US is saying, well, actually, no, we're not going to stop this. And we consider these groups to be different. And then you have the case of this Sunni preacher who lives in Pennsylvania and who Turkey accuses of organizing the coup in 2016, this failed coup against Erdogan. They say you should extradite him, hand him back over to us. He's a terrorist, and the US isn't doing that. And then you have this other business of the Turkish state bank that was at the center of a money laundering scheme on behalf of Iran to evade sanctions. And the bank will now be tried in a federal court in New York, in Manhattan, and potentially faces billions of dollars in fines. President Trump managed to, kind of put a freeze on that process and was looking to get Turkey off the hook. But I don't believe the Biden administration would go down that route and have people like Giuliani come in and put pressure on the Attorney General. That it's, as I said, a whole new world. So very hard to predict at this point how much worse things will get.
Right. So the Biden administration has put out several statements rebuking Turkey over human rights violations and its imprisonment of prominent Turkish philanthropist Osman Kavala. And last week, Turkey's push to dissolve a pro-Kurdish political party drew criticism from the US. So could the administration succeed in pressuring Turkey to reverse its democratic backsliding with this?
Well, however much the Biden administration, emphasizes human rights issues, and that's extremely welcome development. People in Turkey, certainly critics of the Erdogan regime, are very pleased about that. But I think its priority will really be the S-400 issue. And past experience has really shown us that Erdogan doesn't change course just because, either the United States or the European Union makes a statement or rebukes Turkey. He only sort of caves when there's a real consequence to his actions, as we saw when President Trump sanctioned several Turkish cabinet ministers and then placed tariffs on Turkish steel imports, and that sent the Turkish lira, plummeting. And of course, that's when he freed that North Carolina pastor, if you recall, Pastor Brunson, who was being kind of held as a political hostage, if you will. The idea in Erdogan's head was, you have our imam, well, I'm going to hold your pastor, and until you give us the imam, I'm not giving you your pastor back. And then, there was a lot of pressure building up, especially among President Trump's, evangelical base, and he got to the point where he basically told Erdogan that he would get really nasty, and he did for a brief moment. And that's when we saw the pastor get sent back home to the States. So if the Biden administration chooses to get, even harsher, to carry the CAATSA sanctions, one step forward and introduce new sanctions, which, by the way, the Congress is, lobbying for, because the mood in the Congress on the Hill is incredibly negative. I've never seen in all my years of reporting the kind of hostility that Turkey currently faces across the boards, on the Hill, in the administration, in the bureaucracy, even in, you would know this from your reporting, even UCOM, which was traditionally Turkey's big, harassed, cheerleader, is now sort of like kind of fed up with Turkey's behavior, and obviously the media. And it hasn't helped that Erdogan's bodyguards, beat up a bunch of people, with many ending up in hospital right in the heart of Washington, D.C. So all of this has conspired to create an extremely hostile mood towards Turkey.
Okay, I do want to ask what your reaction to Turkey over the weekend withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention, which is the landmark treaty protecting women.
Well, as a woman, obviously, I was horrified, and the reasoning is even more horrifying. The fact that they claim it has nothing to do with, not caring about violence against women, which, by the way, is just off the charts in Turkey. Hardly a day passes without a woman being murdered by a man, very often her own husband. And after having called, the hotline and saying, hey, my life's under threat, and nothing being done about that. No, the government says this is really about society's values and the fact that this convention in some way protects gay people and encourages Turkish people to all become gay. And that's why they've revoked this convention. And of course, the paradox, the irony is that it's this very same government, when it was in reformist mode, when it was doing the right things, the kind of things that led the European Union back in 2005 to open full membership talks with Turkey, with a Muslim country of that size for the first time, that it was this government that hosted the conference where this convention was signed. It was a champion of this, of cracking down on violence against women. And now it's doing this because President Erdogan is trying to cater to his religious base, because his ratings are going down. His poll numbers are melting because, as you probably know, Turkey is facing a serious economic crisis at the moment. So he thinks the way out is just to polarize society even more. And this will be familiar to people in the US, because that's kind of straight out of Trump's playbook, though we tend to believe that Turkey, Mr. Erdogan is the one who inspired President Trump. So, yeah, he's trying to sort of consolidate the religious fanatical base through such actions.
Talk about how Turkey's influence in the region is potentially changing. What are you seeing? Obviously, as the U.S.-Turkey relationship is changing, and as U.S. relationships with other countries in the region are changing, what does that do to Turkey?
Well, Turkey has become much more proactive, as you've seen in Syria. It's, invaded large chunks of northern Syria. It's, changed the course of the war in Libya by providing military assistance to the government in Tripoli, so checking this advance by Haftar's forces. In Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus, it actively intervened on the side of Azerbaijan against Armenia and helped Azerbaijan win back a huge chunk of territory that had been occupied till then by Armenian forces. And also in Iraq, Turkey continues to, attack Kurdish targets there, the group that I mentioned earlier that's fighting the Turkish army. It's called the PKK. And Turkey has developed its own weapons, especially drones, which are proving to be very effective in all of these conflicts. But of course, it's also a result of the vacuum created by America's retreat from the region that's allowed countries like Turkey, the UAE, and others, to become more muscular, to fill that vacuum in the face of this absence of the US, of the absence of US engagement.
Let's talk about that vacuum a little further and jump over to Syria. So this month marked 10 years since the start of the uprising in Syria, and we all remember President Obama's red line fiasco and President Trump's green light for Turkey to invade northern Syria. So what lessons on Syria's war can President Biden draw from his predecessors? What role is left for the US to play in the country?
Well, that's an excellent and extremely difficult question because, from the outset, the United States said that that its presence there, its partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces that are led by this Kurdish militia known as, well, I won't go down that road because all these acronyms are very confusing, but the Syrian Kurds basically are the main players there in that area where the US has its forces. They were their partners in the war against ISIS, but the US said that that partnership was temporary, tactical, and transactional, and that once the war against ISIS was over, that they would I mean, that was implicit that, the relationship would end. But, it hasn't. It hasn't, well, it's clearly, ISIS has no longer controls, territory in Syria. The caliphate, as it were, has crumbled. But that's not to say that there are still some ISIS cells operating and we see them becoming more active, etc. But, I don't think we have yet to see the Biden administration come up with its policy review that's occurring as we speak on Syria, and what kind of arguments it comes up with for maintaining its troop presence there. Obviously, some would call it clientitis. CENTCOM has developed this very tight relationship with the SDF. It's the dream partner force, it's just loyal, effective, does a great job, very pro-American, very friendly. And so, CENTCOM, of course, feels, I would say, emotionally attached. These guys fought together, this bond has formed, and so they're lobbying very hard on behalf of the Kurds. But let's not forget that in the US, the military is a tool. It's not supposed to be making decisions, right? Policy decisions. And there was a vacuum there under the Trump administration. The whole interagency policy-making process no longer existed, kind of like Turkey. And so now we have yet to see, what the effect of now having a normal administration back in place, what the impact of that will be in places like Syria, and how the presence is justified. Because, on the one hand, yes, it's very important to sort of try and help the Kurds get a better deal as Syria moves forward. But there's also this reality that Assad's not going anywhere anytime soon. And at the same time, you see the Russians and the Iranians building up pressure on those US forces there. And of course, the whole fallout with Turkey over that continued partnership. How do you square that circle? We saw the previous administration, particularly the former Syria envoy, Jim Jeffrey, try and find a way of bringing Turkey and the Kurds together, but that didn't work. And so what we saw, the pattern we saw, and the one that I guess the Biden administration will be at pains not to repeat, is one where the US keeps making concessions to Turkey in Syria, as we saw, in the hope that this will somehow get Turkey to a place where it's finally willing to engage with the US's Kurdish partners. But there's absolutely no indication that Turkey will ever get there. Turkey continues to see them as an existential threat, and will, in my view, the next big crisis is, what if Turkey decides to attack again? What will the US response be?
You just described the relationship between Turkey and how they view the Kurds as an existential threat. I'm hoping that you could pull the thread a little bit more on that. Why does Turkey see this as an existential threat, and how widely shared are those views across Turkey?
Excellent question. Well, I would like to preface my answer by saying Turkey's Kurdish problem is largely self-inflicted. The fact that, this group emerged that is fighting the Turkish state is a result of decades of repression, of basically claiming that the Kurds don't even exist, banning their language, and anyone who sort of tried to push back and say, well, hey, I live in this country, but I'm a Kurd. I have a distinct culture, a different language, and I'm trying to learn Kurdish at the moment. And as you know, I'm from Turkey originally, and it's very different, and it's a very complex, very rich language. It's not, it does exist. It's a language, and saying that it doesn't is a joke. And so you had this very violent repression of the Kurds for decades. And so it's hardly surprising that, it reached the point where this group decided to form and push back through, armed violence. And so, okay, let's look at why Turkey feels that these people in northern Syria are such an existential threat. It's because the group that's currently in power there, both politically and the guys who, are partnering with the US, they are an offshoot of this group that's been fighting Turkey all these years. Both the political people there and both the military people there are very tightly linked with this group. And in fact, many of the leaders inside northeast Syria now who are working with the US, and that includes, the commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces, for instance, Muslim Kobani. These are all people who in the past worked with the group that's fighting Turkey. So when you're sitting in Ankara and you see these guys, who were fighting you, now partnering with the US, getting weapons from the US, getting training from the US, your NATO ally, of course, that kind of freaks you out. That's not to say that Turkey is not responsible for that happening, because, Turkey was repeatedly, asked to come up with an alternative to fight the Islamic State. It never did. The Syrian opposition forces are a mess and continue to, wreak havoc, commit war crimes in the areas that are under Turkish control, raping, looting, it's awful what's going on, and documented by the United Nations, in fact. So it's not just Kurdish propaganda, as Turkey would claim. And so, but setting all of that aside, when you're sitting in Turkey and looking at the situation, you're kind of freaked out. And the idea that you could somehow deal with these people actually was one that at one point Turkey did entertain. And so it's important to remember that up until 2015, Turkey was actually negotiating with the Kurdish group that was fighting it and its imprisoned leader. And at the same time was also talking to the group in Syria, because they were looking to do this grand bargain. But when they saw the Syrian Kurds growing stronger and stronger, and especially when the Americans came in 2014, they flipped. They thought, oh my God, this is out of our control. These guys are going to establish their own kind of Kurdish state that, like the guys in Iraq did. And so we're not going to only have the ones in Iraq, but now these guys. And so it's just, the Kurds in Turkey are going to say, hey, our turn next. So they just put the kibosh on that whole peace process that was going on. And we are where we are now today, where Erdogan was also, reverting to the old language of, basically doing what the military did for all these years, painting the Kurds as the big enemy, the great existential threat to Turkey. So not only were they attacking the Kurds in Syria, but at home there's this big assault on the Kurdish political movement there. Their leaders have been imprisoned, their mayors have been unseated, and many of them jailed. And so, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, there are now moves to shut down the third largest political party in Turkey, which is the pro-Kurdish party. And because the government has used such polarizing language, this language of fear, and because it controls the media, that's another thing about Turkey, unfortunately, where the media is really not free anymore at all, and mainly controlled by the government, and lots of journalists in jail. So the public believes this stuff. So the very long-winded answer to your question is yes, there is public support for this in Turkey, and a lot of anti-Americanism, a lot.
Okay. You've obviously reported extensively on Syria's Kurdish population and their experiment with self-rule in northeast Syria. So I think it's been a year and a half since the Turkish incursion now. How has civilian life changed?
In the Turkish-occupied areas? That's another great question, and a very difficult one to answer, because we really don't know. We don't, as journalists, have free access to those areas. And we saw the New York Times go in recently into one of those Turkish-occupied zones, this enclave, Kurdish enclave called Afrin, that was occupied in 2018 by the Turkish military. And, you know, the reporter came away with this very rosy picture of life there, which totally contradicts what we hear from the Kurdish side. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It's definitely nowhere near as rosy as she described. It's probably closer to the way the Kurds describe it. But a lot of lawlessness, but also an effort on the part of the Turkish government to sort of put a very Turkish imprimatur on those regions. So you have Turkish post offices, you know, Turkish language taught in schools there, giant pictures of President Erdogan. That, you know, many of these zones are actually managed from within Turkey. So the governor of a province on the Turkish border is kind of the boss of those areas. So it is really kind of almost got a colonial aspect to it at this point. But the truth is, we honestly don't really know what's happening. Some things we do know, and I've written about this, and it's been documented, is that certainly in the area that they just invaded, the last area that they invaded in October 2019, they're basically arresting people like on claims that they worked for the PKK, this group that fights Turkey. And these are like guys who just work in the local administration. They're sort of basically kidnapping them, if you will, hauling them back to Turkey, putting them in jail and prosecuting them on terror charges. I mean, these are illegal renditions. This is considered to be a war crime. And this is happening. This has been documented. And so that's one thing we know. And it's very alarming, and people's houses being taken over in that other enclave, Afrin, that I mentioned. Turkey, I mean, we hear stories about how farmers are being forced to sell their olives, but that's a place where lots of olives are produced at like rock bottom prices to the Turkey's, you know, Syrian rebel, sort of those Syrian rebel factions supported by. So a lot of extortion going on. It's all kind of horrible. You hear of women being kidnapped, raped in those regions. And there's, you know, quite a bit of that has actually been documented. So quite grim.
It's terrifying and sad to hear those reports.
Indeed.
Yes, you spent time reporting in Al-Hol camp.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of suspected ISIS members and their families are detained in northeast Syria. Many Western governments are reluctant to repatriate them. Can you talk about the concerns of radicalization in the camps and the strain this has put on the SDF, which runs Al-Hol?
It's an an explosive situation. And, you know, you hear daily about reports of people getting killed there. And I mean, I went there twice and interviewed many of these women. I mean, the real problem is not with the majority of the women and children there who happen to be, you know, displaced Syrians and Iraqis who were fleeing the conflict. It's the wives, the families of the foreign fighters who were there. And yes, I mean, it's absolutely a breeding ground for radicalization. I mean, these are women who are raising children to think like them. And I was so struck by the number of little kids who were running around with like plastic rifles and like shooting each other. I thought this was like, oh my God, this is really nuts. And you know, you hear these terrible stories of women, you know, basically torturing other women who don't abide by the rules. I mean, applying very harsh physical punishment to them, and also attacking the SDF, you know, personnel, guards, security people who are supposed to be keeping them under control. And it's almost impossible. And you hear of constant breakouts of people escaping somehow. They managed to smuggle in cell phones and be in contact with, ISIS people outside the camp and find ways to sort of get out and also be disruptive. And of course, the biggest problem is that the Western countries, whose nationals many of these people are, refuse to take them back. They want to take back the children in some cases, but not take back the mothers. And so it's a huge and growing problem. I mean, I guess this sounds horrible, but the only comfort, I guess, is that those women aren't having more children there. But then you hear stories of boys, as they grow up, being married to girls who grow up in the camp, and they somehow manage to conceal this by having the boys who've matured, because once they're of a certain age, they're transferred to other camps, the boys. They just dress them up in chadors, so people don't know. I mean, there's so many thousands of people there, it's hard to kind of keep the tabs on them. And then there's the whole other layer of tragedy with the Yazidis who are still stuck in there.
Oh, it's a lot to take in. More expanding on that, but Syria's war has created the world's largest displacement crisis since World War II. And you talked about how some children may be getting out of camps, but more than 5 million people have fled the country, mostly to Turkey and other neighboring countries. So, and there's resentment against refugees there, and host governments are pressuring them to return home to Syria. Is it safe for them to do so?
Absolutely not. And we've already seen what's happening in these areas where the government has supposedly reconciled with the local population, and the rebels there have left or disarmed. And I mean, they're just treated terribly. I mean, and you see the government, in spite of people, sort of saying, okay, we've given up, we're not, opposed to you anymore or whatever, we're not going to fight you anymore. These people still being, arrested en masse, and people who are considered to not be, in favor of the government. Obviously, that this would mean entire communities, entire towns being deprived of aid, for instance, the little aid that actually gets into Syria. So it's a terrible situation for them. It's absolutely not safe for anybody to go back to regime-held areas in particular. And of course, the situation in Idlib, which is the last major rebel-held enclave that's controlled by this jihadi group, which claims to not be jihadi anymore, used to be formerly affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Well, it's under constant attack from the regime and Russian forces, hospitals, schools bombed, civilian areas bombed indiscriminately. And it's kind of Turkey that's trying to hold, the fort there, trying to sort of hold regime and Russian forces at bay. But it's, they keep encroaching more and more. So where would you go? I guess the safest place still is the Kurdish-controlled area, where you have the US forces. That is still by far the most stable and freest, least repressive part of Syria.
So for context on Idlib, about this time last year, Russia and Turkey reached a ceasefire to halt the fighting there. I guess it's the last major stronghold of opposition, but President Bashar al-Assad has, he's set his sights on retaking Idlib. How likely is a renewed offensive there, and what's at stake for Syria if the region if the fighting reignites?
Well, it's salami tactics, isn't it? You see the Russians and the regime sort of, well, that last big offensive, the Turks pushed back. So they kind of paused, but they already took quite a bit of territory that time. And you now see sort of the Russians and I mean, we just had fresh attacks this past week in Idlib. And I don't think that's going to stop, because the Russians are determined, and certainly the regime is very determined to take that back. And, you know, however much the Russians sort of act as mediators between the regime and the Turks, I think at the end of the day, their end game is to find a way to get the Turks to talk to the regime and sort of reach some kind of deal where the Turks, you know, kind of relent and allow the regime to gradually come back. And, you know, that should be something, obviously, that would be very alarming for the people in Idlib, certainly the guys who run Idlib, HTS, as they're called, this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But at the same time for the Kurds too, because very often these deals are cut at the expense of the Kurds. And that's where the US comes in. And that's why it's so important that the US forces, you know, hang in there, or at least, even if it's not a physical presence, that the Biden administration is able to somehow convey that that's a red line. You know, I'm not a military person, I don't know, you may not have to be physically present and still be able to protect, you know, have a security umbrella of sorts for that region. But, you know, the worse the Turkish-US relationship gets, the more likely it becomes, in my view, that the Turks move closer to the Russian position on Syria as well. And people argue, well, would Turkey really want the Russians and the Syrian regime sort of in those Kurdish areas and working with the Kurds against Turkey and going back to, you know, using the Kurds against Turkey? And my answer to that is, you know, as viewed by Damascus, the Kurds are every bit and a much greater threat to them, to the regime itself. So it wouldn't be interested in doing that at all. On the contrary, I think it would work with Turkey to crush them.
All right, thank you. I want to ask one question from the audience regarding Turkey before. I'd love to get some more insight on your career as a journalist. But before that, just want to ask this question. Do you see a time when Turkey will go back to a time when it was more democratic, with a greater respect for human rights, freedom of the press, and a reliable ally for NATO?
In my lifetime? That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, all indications are that Erdogan will do whatever he can to remain in power. You know, every red line we said he wouldn't cross, he's crossed. So I don't anticipate a democratic transition in the near future, even though we're supposed to be having elections in 2023. That would be presidential and parliamentary elections, and the poll numbers look really bad for him. And I believe that he will do everything he can to make sure that he remains in power. People cite this big upset he suffered in 2019 when the opposition forces, you know, united against him in local elections, mayoral elections across the country, and managed to unseat his mayors in the really important cities of Istanbul, which is the cultural and rather the commercial capital mainly of Turkey. Over 16 million people live there, and the capital Ankara. And that was a huge upset for him. But I would say to that, he will make sure that kind of thing never, ever happens again. So he'll be even more prepared this time. He'll always want to have an election because these kinds of leaders always want a veneer of legitimacy. But I'm quite certain that he will make sure that he stays in power. And I just think it's very hard to sort of push back against that. Because of the way things are set up. There's just no room for any kind of, you know, peaceful dissent of being able to, even go out on the street and have a peaceful demonstration and say, hey, I don't want this. It's just not possible anymore. And as I said, there's media capture. And you have a European Union that still, despite all its, criticism of Turkey, still wants to somehow manage the relationship because, they don't want Turkey to fail. First of all, they have many European banks are highly exposed in Turkey. So if economy crushed, that would have a ripple effect. Let's not forget the very large Turkish diaspora that lives within Europe, and especially Germany, where you have over 3 million people of Turkish origin, and that includes Kurds as well. So, again, if the European Union and Turkey were to, have a clean break, a sort of hard break, that could destabilize those countries where you'd see Turkey leveraging, and Erdogan wouldn't shy away from that, leveraging the Turks in those countries to sort of, to sort of stir things up. And we've already seen sort of signs of this before. So, yeah, I don't expect the European Union to sort of save Turkey's Democrats any more than I actually do the Biden administration. Turkey has to figure this out on its own, and it won't be easy, and it's going to be very painful.
Well, thank you for that answer. It's very insightful.
Depressing.
Not depressing, yes. We have a lot of young members tuning in today, some who maybe want to get into your line of work, particularly in the Middle East. There's no shortage of things to write about there, as we can tell. What advice would you give an aspiring foreign correspondent, and I think particularly a female foreign correspondent?
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, if you want to be a foreign correspondent, there are, several routes. Some people decide to go to the country, set up as a stringer and, sort of draw attention to themselves through their fine reporting. And that usually, sadly, only occurs when there's a war in that country. So we've seen many young journalists sort of make it and get jobs with major publications only after having taken that risk, gone to a conflict zone, and distinguished themselves by taking huge personal risks because, stringers have very little backup. They don't have any of the sort of infrastructure that staff correspondents do with their army of translators, of, fixers and security people who are assigned to protect them, none of that. So it's a huge risk. And I don't think any of those young correspondents' mothers would like me if I said, well, that's a good route, but it is one. And the second, of course, is to try and get a job locally and, do the stuff that's not so sexy and exciting, like covering the metro beat, trying to find a job in a local newspaper and work your way up. It's slower, but, it's another way of doing it. And what, in my experience, certainly for the US press, if you do distinguish yourself in the way I described, say, in a conflict situation, and a major newspapers, you draw their attention, they'll come to you and say, do you want to work for us? But you first have to work at Metro. That happened to me. And I decided not to do that, to just remain as I was in the field as a stringer for many years. But, if you do go to these countries, you have to learn their language. You really do. There's no substitute for speaking people's languages. And as a woman, people ask me very often, is it harder for women? I think it's easier for women because we disarm people much more easily than guys do. And I think we do take risks, and we are very brave. And I think the only, I can't think of any disadvantage really, to be honest, other than when you need to take a leak in the open countryside it's a bit tougher than, a guy needing to take a leak. But my advice is to correspondents anywhere is really to remain curious, to ask lots of questions, to talk to as many people as you can, never be lazy, always make that one extra phone call to stand up your story, always let facts get in the way of a good story, be humble, be respectful, be polite, and never regard yourself as being more important than the subject of your story. Don't get caught up with this celebrity, bug that so many of us do, and that's obviously encouraged by social media.
Very good points, and I can completely sympathize with the taking a leak.
Shut up and report. That's what I say to everybody, to myself primarily, just shut up and report.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. You've spent a lot of time in conflict zones, as you've alluded to, with refugees fleeing war. So talk about the cost of bearing witness to this. What have been some of the most challenging moments for you as a reporter, and how have you coped with those?
I wouldn't know where to start, but I can share one story with you, and this was in 1991, at the very start. In fact, the very first year I became a reporter, I went to Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan now, because they took it back from Armenia. There was this very nasty war between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis over this enclave, this mountainous enclave. And I went in the middle of winter to this, mountain town called Shushi. I keep saying sushi. That was controlled by Azerbaijani forces at the time. And all those guys there were drunk, all the commanders, completely drunk. And it was I and another Turkish woman reporter. We were crazy enough to go there on our own, and all these guys were drunk. And so the commander decided he wanted to have his way with me. It was really scary, and he kept saying, here, come with me to this room. And I was like, well, why don't we play backgammon first? Because I saw this backgammon board in the main room where they were all hanging out, these soldiers, where they were smoking and drinking. And I said, let's have a game first. And so we did, and I beat him, and he was so pissed off. He was so upset that all his guys saw him being humiliated by this woman, that he told us to just get out of there immediately in the middle of the night. It was snowing, I can't describe to you the road to get there, getting down it with a drunk driver. That was really terrifying. But what's really heartbreaking was this one woman who was there, one woman with a little boy who couldn't have been older than 4, and his head was swathed in these bandages, blood-stained bandages. And she was just staring at us imploringly. And we asked them, who is she? This is before the guy decided he wanted to have, his way with me, when we were still doing some reporting there. And they said, oh, she's an Armenian. And so we figured out that she was probably a hostage. And it was very clear that they were both being abused. And, we sort of conferred among ourselves, me and my Turkish colleague, and we're thinking, what can we do? Can we slip her some money? But then, they'd see and they just take it. We didn't know what to do. And we just kept looking at her and hoping we were somehow communicating some positive energy to her. And one of the happiest moments in my life as a journalist was when I read I guess it was about a month later, when Armenian forces took that town. And this lady, Baroness Cox, she's a member of parliament. I don't think she's anymore in the United Kingdom. She came in with the UN, and I think it was the UN or the OSCE, one of those international organizations, in a convoy. She took the woman, got her out. The woman was saved, and then we heard the whole story of how she'd been raped, you know, by all of these soldiers, her child abused, you know, attacked. But we saw her rescued, and that was one of the greatest moments of my life as a journalist. But sadly, many of the other tragedies have never been resolved that I've been witness to. And my goodness, there are many, many of them.
How have you been able to cope with all of those things? I mean, it must have been absolutely wonderful to see that rescue, but as you mentioned, you know, that was one lucky story and many unlucky ones. How do you?
You know what? I just keep doing my job. You know, I don't sit there sort of, you know, sipping my scotch and thinking, you know, these poor people. Of course, I feel terrible for them, but I feel that the best thing I can do is to just keep doing my job and not sort of develop a persona where I'm sort of becoming the victim too, because, oh, I witness all this tragedy. I just keep going, keep doing my job. And I guess, let's do the math, it will be 30 years, won't it? And I still love my work. I would never do anything else. I just love my job. I love the fact that I can go out there and meet all these people. And hopefully, I know this sounds corny, but in some small way, draw attention to their, you know, their situations and maybe make a difference. And this past year, one of the best things that happened was through our reporting, me and a colleague called Dan Wolkowski, through our reporting, we managed to secure the release of 4 Syrian guys who were being held, you know, just for the dumbest reasons and being treated very badly. And that was great. That was great.
Well, thank you. And I don't think I'll ever think about backgammon the same way.
I'm telling you, I beat a Greek Cypriot, again, I'm Turkish, at university, and that was a great moment. And I sort of repeated that performance. And you know, we didn't sit down. I was standing up, and I'm pretty short. You can't see, but I'm 5'1", probably even less now. 5'1", from all this sitting. Oh, the other thing I would advise to all correspondents is exercise, please. We sit so much. Please do your Pilates, your yoga, whatever, just do that. Yeah, so I was standing up, and I had this ridiculous thing on me, this cape. I don't know why I wore a cape in a conflict zone. And it was red. You don't wear red in you know, nobody had given me any tips. I had no idea. I walked into journalism like that, not knowing anything. And yeah, I stood there in my cape, sort of rolling the dice and reciting all the prayers I knew. I'm Muslim, and I was like, anyway, it worked. And it worked out for the poor Armenian woman and her kid in the end. But that town is now back in Azerbaijani hands, and some pretty awful stuff happened again, you know, in this most recent war to take that place back. Terrible atrocities.
I wanted to ask a few questions on press freedom. We're almost out of time. So you've spent a large part of your career reporting in Turkey, and you did touch on this a little bit earlier. But how has press freedom evolved in recent years under President Erdogan, especially since the 2016 coup, and how has it reshaped the media landscape? Can you dive into that a little bit more?
Of course. Well, you know, Turkey is famously the world's leading jailer of journalists. That's sort of become a cliche almost now, and it's not, you know, changed. And you know, you have these ridiculous, I mean, cases where it's just mind-bending, where a journalist will get arrested and charged with terrorist activity for retweeting something, for instance, that's perfectly benign. Let's say a story that says Turkey and the Kurds should be making peace, that, you know, we shouldn't be fighting. Yeah, something like that today is construed as, you know, terrorist activity. I myself happen to be facing several criminal probes over tweets, like really dumb stuff like I just described. And there's currently a warrant for my detention in one of the, and the thing is, you can't even really find out what this is all about because they sort of slap secrecy orders on them. But, you know, more generally, of course, press freedom barely exists. You have a few sort of independent outlets that are tolerated, and, you know, that's all part of the facade. You know, you're supposed to maintain the facade of pluralism somehow by allowing these small, struggling, independent outlets to exist. But, you know, Turkey is just, Erdogan is making sure that he covers all the bases. So he has all these new laws that say, for instance, that Twitter, Facebook, all these social media giants have to have representatives in Turkey, and they've all caved now. And what that means is that the government can go to those representatives and say, hey, take down this content, do this, do that, remove this. And, you know, because it's a business, you see them going along with it. So tremendous pressure on the media, lots of journalists in jail. And, you know, the media that is controlled by the government, it really is just unbelievable, the stuff they publish. I mean, it's Orwellian. I know that sounds hackneyed, but it really is the sort of stuff they propagate. You know, the stuff they say about the Americans, for instance. You know, if you were a steady consumer of government media in Turkey, you would be absolutely convinced that, you know, the US is out to get Turkey, that they were the ones who planned this coup to overthrow Erdogan, that they're the reason the Turkish lira is losing its value. Everything that goes wrong in Turkey is because of America, for example. I mean, there was this one crazy theory where they claimed that the big earthquake in Turkey had happened because all the Chinese were jumping up and down in China or something crazy like that to sort of, I mean, it's just insane. Or maybe that was a different one. I get them all confused, but they did have an insane explanation for why that earthquake occurred, that the seismic activity had somehow been triggered by hostile forces. Maybe it was the Russians, I don't remember. But that was in 1999 before Erdogan came to power. Now it's a whole new level and much more sophisticated because they're pouring billions into it.
Okay. My last question, I'd love to get more of a sense from you on, you know, what kind of constraints you faced in your own reporting. And obviously you've you know, you're so worn out for your detention for tweeting. You know, how has it shaped you as a journalist in terms of?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's one I ask myself constantly because I no longer go to Turkey because, you know, I don't want to go to jail, which is very likely what would happen. So I ask myself, should I still be writing about a country that I can't go to? Is that, you know, right? And I say, yes, it is, because I have the freedom to write honestly now. I've been liberated. You know, I no longer worry if I write X, Y, or Z, will I end up in jail? You know, or will some harm come to me? Or, you know, I report freely now, and I still do, after so many years of reporting from Turkey, have a very good network. So, and of course, technology has made life a lot easier for all of us, as we saw in the pandemic. I'm almost horrified at how I've been able to continue reporting pretty well, you know, even in the absence of travel. It's kind of scary almost that we can do that. But I would still maintain no substitute for being there in person and, you know, with people and, you know, not seeing them in a box, but actually being physically in their environment and see how they respond to that. Anyway, I won't. So how has it influenced me? It's also made me, you know, what I'm trying to make the best of it. So what I do, certainly in countries like Turkey that I can't go to, but more recently, Syria and other places where I can't go to because I'm not vaccinated yet, and I don't want to take any risks because I had a terrible case of both of my lungs collapsed some years ago, so I'm high risk. Anyway, so I can't go to any of these places yet. So what I've developed a system where I apologize. I work with local colleagues, and I bring something to the table. So it would be my access to, say, US officials and other people. I bring something to the table, and they bring all the local reporting, and we fuse it, and we come up with some jolly good stories. So that's what I'm doing right now, increasingly, but I'm very much hoping to return to the field. I've had my first, I'm hoping to have my first dose soon. So once that's, done, I'll be back and up and at them.
Well, I hope you get that vaccine soon. I know that
Thank you.
You're reporting on the ground. So
I hope so
for
too.
all the hard work that you've done throughout your career. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today at the National Press Club. You can check out Amberin's work at almonitor.com and follow her on Twitter at Amberin Zaman. That's AMBERZAMAN.
No, it's AMBERIN.
Oh, we got
ZAMAN.
All right, so let me repeat it one last time. At AMBERINZAMAN. Please follow her.
Yeah, there's no dot. That's my email address. Okay.
And thanks to all those who tuned in today's Conversations with Correspondents series, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, Amberin.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.